All right, I think I'll get us started this afternoon as folks are still entering the Zoom room. A warm welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on National and International Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on Chad Williams' new book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. DuBois and the First World War, published just last month. We're also very fortunate to have with us historians David Blight and Michelle Moyd, who will provide initial comments and launch us into our discussion. To all of you, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the privilege to co-chair the Washington History Seminar series with Eric Arneson of the National History Center and George Washington University. Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of our two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the History and Public Policy program of the Wilson Center. Over the past decade, our two organizations have provided a nonpartisan forum for important new historical publications with this seminar. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who produced the event. Our thanks to them, Rachel Wheatley for the AHA and Pete Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. Details about how to support this seminar are available in the chat function now, and we very much encourage you to lend your support to this pro bono effort for both of our organizations. Finally, join us next Monday for the final seminar session of this semester, featuring a discussion of Sheila Yeager's new book, The Other Great Game, The Opening of Korea and the Birth of Modern East Asia. Just before I turn the Zoom room over to Eric, a couple of technical notes. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A of part of the seminar, hopefully about 5 p.m. or so, we'll get into it. You in the audience have three ways to join the conversation. Our preferred way is for you to hit the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality, and you'll be queued, and then Eric, our moderator today, will call on you to join the conversation. You can also write a comment or a question to the Q&A function, and then Eric will put the intervention to our speakers. And finally, if you'd like to, if you don't have access to these options, email Rachel Wheatley at historians.org, and she'll try to pass your questions to us. With that, I think that's everything. Eric, Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's a genuine pleasure this afternoon to introduce our author. Chad Williams is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. He earned a BA in History and African American Studies from UCLA and both his MA and Ph.D. in History from Princeton University. He's the author of the award-winning Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, published in 2010 by the University of North Carolina Press. It's a terrific book, one I have made great use of in my own work. He's also co-editor of Major Problems in African American History, published by Cengage Learning in 2016. Professor Williams's essays and op-eds can be found in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Time, and The Conversation. And today, he will be speaking on his just published The Wounded World, W.E.B. DuBois and the First World War, published, as Christian said, just last month by Farrar, Straus. Chad, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished seminar series. Always good to see you. And want to acknowledge the AHA, the Wilson Center, for their support in organizing this. Want to thank in advance David and Michelle for taking the time to be in conversation with us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone logging in for joining us. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. I'm really eager to get into the conversation. I'm really eager to get into the conversation, but I'll talk a little bit about my book first, and then we can, just kind of open things up. So I'm going to start in October of 2000. I had just started research for my dissertation on African-American soldiers in World War I, which became my first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, and was visiting the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where the majority of W.E.B. Du Bois's papers are archived. And I had been very responsible in advance and gone through the finding aid and seen a curious reference to Du Bois' World War I materials. So I was very intrigued, had no idea what it could possibly be, but thought I'm going to UMass Amherst anyways, I might as well check this out. I go to the library special collections desk in the appropriately named W.E.B. Du Bois Library, huge towering library, as David well knows, on UMass's campus. I asked the archivist to see this collection, and I'm expecting maybe a folder, maybe a box if I'm lucky. Instead, the archivist returns with 6 microfilm reels. So at this point, I'm really intrigued. What could this possibly be? I load the first reel, and to my surprise, I see a table of contents. A table of contents to an 800-page, unfinished and unpublished manuscript by W.E.B. Du Bois on the Black experience in World War I. This was followed by the actual manuscript, as well as all of Du Bois's research materials and his correspondence related to this book, which he evocatively titled The Black Man and the Wounded World. So needless to say, again, keep in mind, I'm a young graduate student, just started my dissertation. I was shocked, thrilled, completely overwhelmed, and in all honesty, confused. I had so many questions. What was this book? What was this book about? Why did Du Bois write it? How long did he ultimately work on it? Why was it incomplete and unpublished? Why had no other historians talked about it? So many questions. But as I began to immerse myself in Du Bois's unfinished book and learn more about it, I became captivated by the story surrounding it, which is truly remarkable. It's a story, as I chronicle in my book, about the challenges of being African American. It's a story about race and democracy, about history and memory. It's a story about hope and disillusionment, faith and tragedy, determination and failure. It's a story of Du Bois in all of his brilliance and all of his flaws, wrestling with the catastrophe of World War, its legacies, and the resulting historical and personal wounds. So this is the story that I tell in my book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War. Now, there's obviously a lot we can talk about in terms of Du Bois's background. Maybe that'll come up in our conversation. But I want to focus on 1914, the start of the First World War. Du Bois considered himself to be a pacifist. He pinpointed the origins of the war in the competition amongst the European belligerents for imperial control of Africa and its people. However, he ultimately believed that the best hopes for democracy hinged on victory by the Allies over Germany. So when Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress on April the 2nd, 1917, and declared war on Germany, Du Bois set aside his pacifist principles and did not oppose the United States entering the conflict. He argued that it presented an opportunity for African Americans to stake claim to their citizenship and bring meaning to Wilson's claim that the world must be made safe for democracy. Black people, Du Bois reasoned, had fought in the past, and now they would do so again with the hopes that the two warring ideals of being Black and being American that he famously articulated in his 1903 classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, would at last be reconciled. So Du Bois threw himself into the war effort. He encouraging African Americans as soldiers and as civilians to demonstrate their loyalty on and off of the battlefield. But white supremacy tested his patriotism from the start. Along with other African Americans, he had to reckon with a number of horrific moments, one of the worst being the East St. Louis pogrom in July of 1917, which left hundreds of Black people dead. But Du Bois's biggest test came when he published Close Ranks in the July 1918 issue of The Crisis magazine, which he edited for the NAACP. The Great War represented, in his words, the crisis of the world. Du Bois argued that however distant the war seemed, the Black people had, these are his words, no ordinary interest in the outcome. For this reason, African Americans had to make their allegiances clear. Let us, while this war lasts, Du Bois wrote, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills. Du Bois's words. Close Ranks unleashed a firestorm of controversy. The Boston civil rights activist and one-time ally of Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, labeled him, among other insults, quote, a rank quitter of the fight for rights. A rank quitter of the fight for rights. From coast to coast, many African Americans branded Du Bois as self-serving at best and at worst, a traitor to the race. Now, for a man who had committed his life to the cause of freedom and justice for Black people, no charge could be more hurtful. The uproar and damage to his radical credentials left Du Bois deeply wounded. So as the end of the war neared, Du Bois, his credibility tattered, his leadership in question, sat in arguably the most precarious position of his otherwise illustrious career. Then, quite unexpectedly, an opportunity presented itself. At the October 1918 Board of Directors meeting, the NAACP proposed that Du Bois spearhead production of a book on the history of the Black experience in the war. He leapt at the opportunity. The scholar in Du Bois was intrigued, but more importantly, here was a chance for redemption. So we began work on his book, and he immediately set his sights on France, where, as he would later write, quote, the destinies of mankind center. On December 1st, 1918, Du Bois departed from Hoboken, New Jersey, as part of the official press delegation accompanying Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference at Versailles. Du Bois spent a remarkable 3 months in France. He organized a landmark Pan-African Congress in February of 1919, but his principal mission, as he described it, was to conduct research for the NAACP war history. He toured the battlefields, seeing with his own eyes the incomprehensible devastation of the war. He literally stood in the trenches. Most importantly, he talked directly with Black soldiers and officers. With military intelligence following his every move, Du Bois absorbed tale after tale after tale of discrimination, slander, and abuse inflicted upon Black servicemen at the hands of the American army. Never in my life have I heard such an astounding series of stories. It's what Du Bois wrote from France in a letter back to his NAACP colleagues. So he knew what he needed to do. He wrote, I can solemnly say without hesitation, the greatest and most pressing and most important work for the NAACP is the collection, writing, and publication of the history of the Negro troops in France. Du Bois returned to the United States that spring, enraged, embarrassed, and determined. He channeled his frustrations, along with the anguish of the African-American servicemen he encountered in France, into the Crisis magazine, and especially the May 1919 issue, where in the editorial Returning Soldiers, he declared, we return from fighting, we return fighting. History would be Du Bois's central battlefront in the struggle over the meaning of the war. He encouraged readers of the crisis and Black soldiers in particular to, in his words, help in the compilation of his book. Letters, diaries, photographs, official military documents, personal memoirs quickly flooded Du Bois's office. Du Bois promised that his book, which he tentatively titled The Negro in the Revolution of the 20th Century, would appear by the fall of 1919. But Du Bois's faith in the revolutionary potential of the war would be severely tested throughout that summer. From Washington, D.C. to Chicago to Phillips County, Arkansas, race riots and full-scale massacres exploded throughout the country. The number of lynchings skyrocketed, which included several Black veterans, some still in their uniforms. James Weldon Johnson, Du Bois's NAACP colleague and good friend, labeled these bloody months the Red Summer. The horror of the Red Summer of 1919 stunned Du Bois. As he wrote in his book, Darkwater, which he completed amidst the tumult and disillusionment of 1919, how great a failure, and a failure in what does the World War betoken? It's the question he asked in Darkwater. Remarkable, asking this question in 1920. How great a failure, and a failure in what does the World War betoken? So Du Bois set out to answer this question. He committed himself to writing. He devoted significant time throughout much of 1920 and into 1922, often staying up late into the night, well past his usual bedtime of 10 p.m. He was a stickler for getting to bed on time. Committed to drafting potential chapters for his book, what he confidently believed would be the definitive history of the Black experience in the war. And maybe in our conversation, I'm more than happy to go into more detail about the substance of what his book was shaping up to be. But these early chapter drafts really reflected an attempt by Du Bois to try and find redemptive value in the global catastrophe and his own very complicated place in it. As the years went on, Du Bois's disillusionment with the war continued to deepen. The worsening conditions facing African Americans and peoples of African descent throughout the entire diaspora caused him to further struggle with the war's individual and collective meaning. He also had to contend with personal tragedies, like the January 1922 death of Colonel Charles Young, his closest Black friend, the highest ranking Black officer in the war, and the man who, in Du Bois's eyes, best embodied the quest to reconcile race and country. All these ugly reminders of the war's legacy further validated the new title Du Bois would give to his book, The Black Man and the Wounded World. As this title reflected, Du Bois's initial hopes of the war as a potentially revolutionary moment in the reconstruction of global race relations had evolved to an interpretation of the conflict as one of the darkest moments in modern world history. The war was a global tragedy that, along with laying the seeds for future war, strengthened white supremacy and furthered the economic exploitation of peoples of African descent. No surprise then that he described the war in the opening chapter of his book manuscript as, quote, a scourge, an evil, a retrogression to barbarism, a waste, a wholesale murder. Du Bois's public announcement in 1924 of The Black Man and the Wounded World sparked renewed public interest in his book. Encouraged, he began to write again. By 1926, he had drafted the bulk of his envisioned chapters. He also applied for research support and secured a 2-year fellowship from the Rosenwald Fund in 1931. The book, finally, after several years, seemed on the verge of completion and possible publication. However, Du Bois's guilt about his decision to support the war continued to gnaw at him. In a 1930 letter to a magazine editor, he admitted, in his words, that he was, quote, ashamed of my own lack of foresight. And that, quote, instead of a war to end war or a war to save democracy, we found ourselves during and after the war descending to the meanest and most sordid of selfish actions. And we find ourselves today nearer moral bankruptcy than we were in 1914. These are Du Bois's views, beginning of the 1930s. By the middle of the 1930s, by the middle of the decade, Du Bois's politics had moved further to the left, and he began to envision the Black man and the wounded world as an explicit lesson about the horrors of modern warfare. A trip around the world in 1936 brought even greater clarity to the book's new significance. Du Bois spent 7 months abroad, first visiting Hitler's Germany in the summer of 1936 during the Olympic Games. Then he went to China and finally to Imperial Japan. He returned to the United States in December of 1936, having seen firsthand the seeds of the next World War. The need for his book could not have been more urgent. He wanted people to see that the still open wounds from the last World War promised an even greater disaster in the near future. With a sense of desperation, he applied for additional funding support, but was rejected at every turn. By 1940, just as Hitler prepared for the German army to invade France, Du Bois, disillusioned, disheartened with a Second World War, a tragic reality, abandoned hope that he would finish and publish his book. Despite an investment of more than 20 years, despite a manuscript over 800 pages in length, The Black Man and the Wounded World, Du Bois's epic history of the Black experience in the First World War, would never see the light of day. So the question that I naturally get, why didn't Du Bois finish his book? Maybe that was a question that David and Michelle are going to throw at me, but I'm going to preempt you. Why didn't Du Bois finish his book? As I write about in my book, Du Bois suffered from what we might describe as intellectual shell shock when it came to writing about and rationalizing a war defined by its irrationality. In his semi-autobiographical 1940 book, Dusk of Dawn, he wrote, quote, "In my effort to reconstruct in memory my thought and the fight of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People during the World War, I have difficulty in thinking clearly." These are Du Bois's words, difficulty in thinking clearly. Even up to the final years of his life, Du Bois still sought to understand why he had supported the war in the first place. "I felt for a moment as the war progressed that I could be without reservation a patriotic American," Du Bois wrote at the time in his 80s in his posthumously published autobiography. "I'm not sure," these are Du Bois's words, "I'm not sure that I was right, but certainly my intentions were. I did not believe in war, but I thought that in a fight with America against militarism and for democracy, we would be fighting for the emancipation of the Negro race. With the armistice came disillusion. That disillusion stayed with Du Bois until his death on August 27, 1963 in Accra, Ghana. The war consumed Du Bois. It confounded him. He could not make sense of it as both a personal as well as a historical moment. He was unable to muster the intellectual fortitude and at many times even the moral courage to complete his book. His failure embodied the tragedy and failure of the war that he struggled so mightily to write about. So in this sense, The Black Man in the Wounded World, we might say, was Du Bois himself. So why does this story matter? The story that I talk about in my book. Well, quite frankly, it matters because Du Bois matters. Du Bois remains arguably the greatest Black intellectual this country has ever produced. And as I discuss, as I demonstrate in my book, understanding his relationship to World War I allows us to understand him anew by acknowledging the importance of the war in his life and work. Moreover, just as we rightly celebrate Du Bois's genius, we must also understand his full humanity, someone who hoped and dreamed, someone capable of making the wrong decision, someone capable of even failure, but also someone who changed. The failure of World War I and ultimately the failure to complete the Black man and the wounded world were essential to Du Bois's political evolution and his radicalism. By the late 1940s, he became a staunch peace activist, and in the eyes of the federal government, in the midst of the Cold War Red Scare, a distinct threat. In 1951, he was indicted and tried by the federal government on charges of being an agent of a foreign principal, just for advocating for peace. He ultimately won an acquittal, but the ordeal and subsequent seizure of his passport by the government were a painful reminder that for a Black person, criticizing America and fighting for peace came with tremendous risk and cost. In his 1952 book, In Battle for Peace, Du Bois wrote, quote, "As then a citizen of the world, as well as of the United States of America, I claim the right to know and think and tell the truth as I see it. I believe in socialism as well as democracy," Du Bois wrote. "Above all else," he declared, "I hate war." But the story I tell in my book, I believe, also goes beyond Du Bois. It reveals to us the impact of World War I on African Americans and how it exposed the core tensions of African American identity and how it shaped the history, the broader history of racial struggle in the 20th century and even up to the present. For Du Bois, the history of World War I was not simply an intellectual challenge. It was a profoundly personal, moral, and ethical challenge as well. It still is. Du Bois understood that the history of the war was deeply bound with the political status of Black people, the future of democracy, and the condition of the world we live in. It still is. More than a century after the First World War, many of the same struggles Du Bois confronted: white supremacist violence, creeping fascism, wealth inequality, modern forms of voter disenfranchisement, right-wing assaults on the truth, exorbitant government spending on the military, preparation for endless war. These still remain urgent matters today. So Du Bois, through his life, his work, and his voice, has tasked us with fighting for democracy and working with all of our strength to heal our still wounded world. So that's my book, and I look forward to the conversation. Turn things over to my distinguished discussants.
Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to talk about. Our first discussant this afternoon is Michelle Moyd, who is currently the Red Cedar Distinguished Faculty Member at Michigan State University. She is an historian of Eastern Africa who studies the region's history of soldiering and warfare. Her first book, Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest, and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa, was published by Ohio University Press in 2014. It explores the social and cultural history of African soldiers in the colonial army of German East Africa, today Tanzania. She is also the co-author of Linguistic Disobedience, Restoring Power to Civil Language, published by Palgrave in 2018. She is at work on a book entitled Africa, Africans, and the First World War, which examines the spectrum of African experiences in the war, especially as soldiers and workers. Michelle, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Arneson, and I'm so glad to be here. So I would like to thank you and the organizers for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event in honor of Professor Williams' highly anticipated book, The Wounded World. I'm really so honored to be here. So in trying to decide where to start a commentary on this magnificent accomplishment, this book, my mind kept returning to a specific encounter I had with a book that plays an important role in the wounded world. Sometime in the late 1990s, I was in a used bookstore in Colorado Springs, in Colorado, with some friends. I stumbled across an old book, drawn to the title on its spine, The American Negro in World War I. I pulled it off the shelf, noting the gold buffalo embossed on its black cover, which immediately called to mind the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, so-called Buffalo Soldiers, the segregated units of African-American soldiers that were formed after the U.S. Civil War, which I knew a bit about from my father, an Air Force veteran, who had often shared his interest in African-American military history with me growing up. Flipping through the pages, I was enthralled with the many images of Black soldiers and the effort to narrate this tremendously complicated history, although I didn't know how complicated at the time. I asked my friends timidly, "What's the most you've ever paid for a book?" I don't remember their answers, and I guess it didn't matter in the end. I left the store with my first purchase of a rare book. It has followed me to many new homes, though I hadn't thought of it in quite a while before I picked up Professor Williams' The Wounded World. So in Williams's brilliant narrative of Du Bois's desire and ultimate failure to publish the definitive history of the Black experience of World War I learned that Scott's book, the rare book that I had stumbled upon that day in the Colorado bookstore, had played a key, troublesome part in Du Bois's life during and after the war. Williams's book deftly lays out the fascinating, frustrating intrigue between Du Bois, Emmett Scott, and Carter G. Woodson and others over this potential publication. Williams thus offers a glimpse into some of the urgent intellectual debates taking place in African-American life during this violent, tumultuous period. Du Bois's initial urge to collaborate on the project gave way to his sense that he was the only one capable of doing it properly. And of course, the story is much more complex, but it kind of boils down to that. As Williams shows in this meticulously researched and beautifully crafted book, Scott won the race to publishing the first history of Black military service in World War I, but it was not the book Du Bois imagined by a long shot. We never got that book. Fortunately, though, we have Williams's extended analysis of Du Bois's intent for the book and why he never completed it. Williams traces Du Bois's failure to finish The Wounded World, arguing that in order for Du Bois to become the dedicated peace activist he became later in life, he had to abandon the book project that laid bare some of the central contradictions of African-American life and his place within them. And I quote here, "The one book he did not produce, still tucked away in his voluminous files, its pages becoming more faded and brittle by the day, spoke to his struggle to reconcile the contradictions of race, war, Americanness, and democracy, and his complicated place in this nexus," end quote. Williams reminds readers of the, quote, generative power of failure. In this case, Du Bois sharpened his political commitments, allowing him to, quote unquote, atone for the World War I writing that undermined his reputation as a Black radical thinker. Close ranks, which Chad explained in his remarks a few minutes ago, the short essay in the crisis that many African Americans saw as a betrayal of Du Bois's ideals. As Williams writes, again, quote, "World War I and its lessons, personal and historical, fueled his dogged critique of white supremacy, empire, and most of all, war itself," unquote. Du Bois exhibited one of the best qualities over the course of his life, the ability to change. But to do so, he had to walk away from a project that mired him in a central conundrum of African-American life, the problem of no sacrifice ever being enough to fully secure the right to exist as a Black person in the United States. There are so many aspects to this book that I could highlight, of course, but I must just limit myself to a few in the interest of getting to hear Dr. Williams talk more about this marvelous research. So my first kind of observation is that this book is in some essential ways about Du Bois as a writer. I don't need to say anything about the quality and quantity of his work, of course, but what interests me in how Williams writes about Du Bois's writing, how Williams writes about Du Bois's writing life and the challenges that he faced in that life is that they resonate so much in terms of what we might think of as something like project management and all the things that can get in the way of publishing what authors and scholars want to publish and how they want to publish them. Du Bois approached this project with all the gusto one would expect, wanting to gather all the right materials. And here I will just name spending time in France amongst the soldiers that he was most interested in representing in this book, and really trying to get at the experience of having been in the field in combat, and also having experienced the horrendous white supremacist racist actions that harmed them in many ways. So he wants to gather all the right materials. He wants to make all the right connections. He wants to ground it in wider literatures. He wants to get the story right. Yet he couldn't keep his promises, not to fellow writers and researchers, not to the veterans whose materials he held in his personal archive, not to his backers. I appreciate that Williams lays all of this out as a part of Du Bois's professional and personal disposition. This is an intellectual history of a writer who for many years could not get out of his own way to write a book that meant a lot to him. And I just kept thinking about this all the way through the book because of the attention that Chad pays here to the writing and the problems that Du Bois faced in a number of registers as he was trying to get this book written. Second major observation, I kept coming back to Williams's success in rendering Du Bois the subject of a kind of history of emotions. Williams is attentive to the ways that Du Bois's epistolary, I never remember how to say that word, but I think it's epistolary practices and other writing often signaled his inability to move the Wounded World project forward. He imagines Du Bois experiencing anger at receiving upsetting mail. He notes when tears flowed, when Du Bois was being cunning, and so on. He places Du Bois within a dense web of personal connections across an astonishing range of social, professional, and cultural fields. And again, it's not that we don't know these things about Du Bois, of course, but there's a way that Chad is able to capture the density of these connections across time and space that really enliven him and give us a lot to work with or to think with in imagining him trying to get this project done. So I really appreciate this effort to show Du Bois as an intellectual powerhouse who nonetheless embodied all human emotions and acted on them in ways that impeded his progress, damaged his relationships, and angered folks who had supported him. And here again, I'm thinking of the Black veterans of World War I who entrusted him with their materials only for him not to honor the promise of publication. And some of them having to really push him to return stuff to them after they got tired of waiting. All too human, all too academic. Third point, as a historian of Africa, African colonial soldiers in World War I was struck by Du Bois's inability to be as critical of France and its experience with African troops as he was of the US. On one level, I understand this fully, given the particular forms of white supremacist violence to which African Americans were subject in the US and abroad during the war, and the appearance of France as a less hostile space for Black folks. Still, his inability or unwillingness to process French empire and colonialism in its many registers of global violence, at least in the 1920s, is troubling. His impulse to think on a global scale about Blackness and military sacrifice was ambitious and in many ways necessary, and we still need it. But yet his tendency to revere military accomplishments and the lure of citizenship led him to sideline the continuing power of European empire, delaying a vital critique that might have aligned him with more radical thinkers earlier than he did. Of course, this is with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of having seen the ins and outs of Du Bois's thinking through Williams's dedication to organizing the materials and narrating the very history that Du Bois never finished. This is an incredible accomplishment. I'm, of course, barely scratching the surface, and I can't wait to follow the many paths this book opens up for me as I think about how to write the global history of World War I with the African continent at the center. Dr. Williams, thank you for your work, which now makes a whole new realm of work possible.
Thank you very much. Chad, if you wish to reflect or comment, feel free.
Oh my goodness, there's so much here. Thank you, Michelle. I'm such a tremendous admirer of your work. I cannot wait for your book. I'm sure Du Bois would be eagerly anticipating your book as well. Let's see. I mean, so funny that you stumbled upon Emmett Scott's book, which, as you said, was plays a very interesting role in the initial stages and development of Du Bois's book. And thank you for acknowledging the point that I tried to make about failure as generative for Du Bois, thinking about Du Bois even in relationship to failure of any sort is certainly something that we're not accustomed to, but something that I really wanted to try and explore and push forward as a central theme in the book. Just the points that you raise, I mean, yes, in some ways this was a very kind of curious, even at times troubling book for myself to produce as a writer, because I can empathize with Du Bois, his struggles, his challenges. There are many moments where I thought I might end up like Du Bois and not finish my own book. So that would have been really very meta. But yeah, I think understanding Du Bois as a writer on this particular project, hopefully allows us to understand his intellectual life, his intellectual process in a different way. The ways in which World War I really shaped much of his writings throughout the interwar period, whether it's a book like Darkwater in 1920, The Gift of Black Folk, Black Reconstruction, which I talk about, thinking about the ways in which his struggles to write about World War I were also connected to how he's thinking about the Civil War and Reconstruction period, as well as just the tremendous challenges that came with writing about a subject, conceptualizing the First World War, the Great War, as it was described at the time, as history, when that history was still unfolding, a history that Du Bois was so intimately connected to, that he was himself a part of, and how that was really reflective, as I argue, of one of the major reasons why he wasn't able to finish his book, which would have been one of his most significant works of history. I definitely wanted to try and humanize Du Bois, to explore the range of his different emotions, to kind of dip my toes, into the messy waters of psychoanalysis. I know that's something historians, were sometimes scared to do, but I think it was important to really take Du Bois and his emotions seriously, and how that ultimately did play a role in his struggle to write about the First World War. What it meant for him to be accused of being a traitor to the race. I mean, that was a charge that I think truly stung Du Bois to his core. Du Bois, he writes early in his career, his credo, his life credo, where he lays out all of his core principles. And his opposition to war is part of that credo, and what it meant for him to go against that credo, and to have to reckon with, the failures of his decision to support the war. I think that was something that he really struggled with on an intellectual level, but also on an emotional level as well. And then you're absolutely right. His lack of critical analysis of France, particularly at the early stages when he's writing his book, in the early 1920s. In some ways, he's still kind of wrapped up in the euphoria of his Pan-African Congresses of 1919 and 1921. But also, this, image of French racial egalitarianism juxtaposed to the horrific racism, white supremacy of the United States and the United States Army that he witnessed with his own eyes. So I think, again, his hopes, right, for democracy were so strong and so invested, in this ideal of French racial democracy that it really blinded his critical analysis. Now, he certainly changes. I think if he had ultimately finished his book, in the late 1930s or even in the 1940s, his critique of France and French empire would have looked much different. So again, part of the story I tell is how Du Bois evolves and how his understandings of the history of the war evolve along with his politics and his critique of empire as well. So again, thank you so much for your observations and your comments.
Thank you. Before we move on, let me just remind those of you in the audience, if you wish to pose a question directly, you can use the raise hand function. You can get in the queue now. And when we get to that part of the seminar, I can call on you, you unmute, you get to pose your question. We have a number of people already in the Q&A, but please feel free to join that queue as well. Our second discussant this afternoon is David Blight, the Sterling Professor of American History at Yale University. He joined the faculty there in 2003. He previously had taught at Amherst College for 13 years. Since 2004, he served as director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery Resistance and Abolition at Yale. Amongst David's many books are Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, published by Harvard in 2001, Frederick Douglass's Civil War, Keeping Faith in Jubilee, Louisiana State University Press in 1989, and Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, published by Simon & Schuster in 2018. That book, it so happens, won the Pulitzer Prize for History the following year. David, we're delighted you could join us. The screen, all yours. If you unmute first.
There we go. Sorry. How many times we have to do this before we get it right? Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Christian. And I must say thank you, Michelle. Say hello to the Red Cedar for me. My education all began at Michigan State, and my heart is still on the banks of the Red Cedar. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing the fight song or anything. But anyway, and Chad, I'm not going to spend my little time here gushing all the time, but this book, my friend, is an achievement, a real achievement. It's an achievement of research, but it's much more than that. It's an achievement of writing. There is a seamless character to your narrative. This is a huge story to hold together, which anyone studying Du Bois finds out. There's just too much Du Bois. I remember somebody once saying to me, this was before David Lewis did his 2-volume biographies, that no one's ever going to really write a real life of Du Bois because no one is smart enough. Well, there are one or two of you now. Anyway, first of all, Michelle has good reason to use this book deeply for her new book, but so do I. I don't know if we've had a chance to talk about it. My next book is on James Weldon Johnson. And his papers are, 90% of his papers are all here at Yale. And when I started working in the JWJ papers, the first place I went was to the D's. I wanted to read that correspondence with Du Bois because I just could. I'm still trying to figure out how did those two really get along so well. It's amazing. Anyway, but here's what I loved about the book, and then maybe a couple things to think about. Now, I want to hear you talk some more on. Years and years ago, I remember people saying, okay, enough with double consciousness already. Haven't we had too many essays on double consciousness? That's all we ever talk about anymore in Black studies. Well, here again. No, we're not done talking about it. It's all over this story. The doubleness of himself, the doubleness of African Americans, the doubleness of a soldier, the doubleness is everywhere here, and you didn't overdo that. You just now and then point to it, which I liked. I really liked that. I want to hear you out loud a little bit more on how a genius like Du Bois, in that period from, let's just say, 1912 to 16, 17, or just with the election of 16 and then 17, from whence this amazing idealism, that this colossal, catastrophic war was going to change the world so much. I mean, because hence the disillusionment, because if the degree of that idealism, that hope, that faith would set up anybody for disillusionment with almost anything. So, I mean, if you could, I mean, you do get to this in your book of where this comes from, but take us there maybe even a little more. I love the framing of the book. 3 big themes: hope, disillusion, failure. Great conception overall, and it fits. And we're thinking about disillusion while we're still reading the hope section, and we're thinking about failure well before we finish the disillusion section. I mean, that's really well constructed. And to your point about the DuBois papers and finding that incredible manuscript, I worked in DuBois's papers in those years I was in Amherst. I co-edited a new edition of Souls of Black Folk with my old friend Bob Gooding Williams, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember being stunned at many things in those papers. First of all, they're just voluminous. And this was before microfilm, I'm afraid, I have to admit, and we got to actually hold the stuff. But one of the things I was so stunned by is how much world history this man had read. And then he kept timelines. You probably saw this. He kept dozens and dozens and dozens of timelines of the history of everywhere in the world. And he always did them on graph paper. This has something to do with the way his mind worked. I'm not sure I could ever quite figure it out. But he had timelines on China, timelines on South Asia, timelines on all the parts of Africa, timelines for Europe, timelines for Latin America. You saw the historian at work in him. He was just always assembling this stuff. And he may have gone to bed at 10 every night, but I don't know where he got that kind of energy. I don't want to take up all of our time because I suspect there's a lot of questions out there. But I do want to say just one or two other things. You show in vivid detail, excruciating detail at times, the impact of so many lynchings, not just the Red Summer, 1919, but well before that, and then again well after that. And I'm wondering just how much that plays in his degree of disillusion. I mean, he knew about lynchings. He'd witnessed one in Atlanta. I mean, everybody knew about lynchings. But this level of violence during the war, right after the war, and continuing into the 20s, and then the failures of that anti-lynching bill, which, Johnson is in Washington lobbying for constantly. I mean, in some ways, if America is a failure, it's just about as terrible an example as you can get. So just a thought. I also, like Michelle, loved the approach you had to DuBois as writer. You show us at times that this man deserves that label of prophetic writer. He can capture the zeitgeist. He can do that over and over and over and over. And there's so few writers who can actually pull that off. A last point, although I've got a lot of other questions I'd love to talk with you about. Well, 2 other things quickly. One is your role here as a biographer. And you're balancing a lot of different types of history, and your reviewers out there should quit trying to place this in some genre of history. It's many different kinds. It's biography. It's the social history of war. It's intellectual history. It's even organizational history to some degree. You get inside the NAACP, which is something I'm trying to understand with James Weldon Johnson, who was its essential leader for 14 years. But as a biographer, you do at times stop and just do biography. You take us to his ego. You take us to this personality. He can't bear Emmett Scott getting this thing out before. He doesn't like him. He doesn't want that book out before him. And one of the things you raise, and if this was nothing but biography, you might have done even more with, is just who are his friends I mean, you say he has 4 or 5 essential dear friends in his life, Charles Young being one of them. My God, that relationship was important. And that, I mean, you've demonstrated more than anybody ever has, I think, the way Charles Young affected Du Bois's view of war. If there could be a Charles Young, there must be something glorious about war. It seemed to be the way Du Bois viewed it, because that guy was so impressive. The relationship with James Weldon Johnson, the relationship with Spingarn, and so on. But then the rivalries. Oh my God, Emmett Scott, Garvey, Monroe Trotter, even Carter Woodson. Everyone loves to love Carter Woodson, but Du Bois didn't love him. and that's biography. These are terrible rivalries and pretty vicious at times. And you go there. And I love that part. Last idea. You raise it again and again, especially in the failure section of the book. And that's this theme of tragedy. Too often tragedy, I think, becomes one of those words we use as a descriptive without digging deeper into what it actually means. Through its various definitions through history, the Greeks, medieval forms of tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy, so on, so on, so on. The 20th century did something to the concept of tragedy like nothing before, and it's the World War. But I think Du Bois always had a sense of tragedy. I wonder if you do. I mean, when Bob Gooding Williams and I were trying to figure out what to call our introductory essay to Souls of Black Folk, we called it Du Bois and the Tragedy of American History. Because even then, I mean, in that first great work of his life, he had it, and by tragedy, I mean the genuine sense, this idea that there are some things in the world kind of fated that we don't control. There are things that happen to us that we just are not in charge of. There are forces that make human beings do things they can't imagine, and on and on. The biblical sense of tragedy. And Du Bois was steeped in that stuff. It's part of his Germanophile view of history, I think. But, he is a living tragedy here too, which I don't think is the way most people see Du Bois, because of this story and because of this, as you call it quite forthrightly, the guilt he carried with him about closed ranks. He never got over that. He never, the haunt of that was with him forever. And it is, as I think you show, it's one of the ways to chart his course toward radicalism, because he was never, ever going to be caught doing that again about the United States or anywhere else. And yet, a weird kind of radical patriotism doesn't just die for him. It kind of survives in different forms, maybe not all the way to the end, but that word tragedy, that idea of tragedy is one of the things that comes out of your book that I find valuable and powerful, especially for American readers who just don't even really like the concept, frankly. And last but not least here, there's a lot of books on Du Bois now. Literary people have studied Du Bois. Political scientists have studied Du Bois. It's just happening with Douglas too. Every discipline gets their hack at Douglas now. But you've shown there was a great new book to write on Du Bois, and my friend, I think you've done it conceptually, mastering the material, the lyrical ways you are able to write this complicated story, and taking us to this turning point in history. It's easy now because we've had so many wars, this, so many wars, so many real tragedies, to forget just what a turning point World War I was in the conceptions people had of the world, of history, of themselves. So anyway, I did end up gushing about the book mostly, so sorry about that.
I'm sure you'll complain about that, Chad.
Yeah, right. You can keep going if you want. No,
I could. No, you go ahead. Sorry.
No, thank you. So, I mean, there's so much here. Yeah, I'll just start with tragedy. I mean, since you brought that up, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I had to think about what it meant to not only think about Du Bois through the lens of the tragic, and obviously in relation to the greatest tragedy of the 20th century at the time, the Great War, but to also write my book kind of in the mode of tragedy as well, right? And that was a challenge, right? Because as you said, I mean, there's been so many books on Du Bois, so many of them are celebratory, and rightly so, of his genius, his accomplishments. But, if we want to take Du Bois seriously, I think we do have to reckon with the place of tragedy in his intellectual life, in his personal life as well. That's something that I wanted to also tease out, how, Du Bois is just this remarkable individual, tremendous ego, steely confidence. Once you start peeling back the layers, there's so many moments of tragedy that he had to contend with, right? And his emotional stoicism, obviously kind of shields us from seeing that. But I wanted to try and understand him kind of on that level. But I also think it goes to your point about two-ness, right? And how Du Bois always kind of thought in terms of dualities, right? Double consciousness. But also this relationship between kind of beauty and tragedy, right? How Du Bois is always searching for kind of the beauty in the world, right? But also, acknowledging, the simultaneous, tragedy and horrors of the world as well. And I think, World War I, as it was for so many intellectuals throughout the world, was such a disjunctive moment, right? When their beliefs in progress, right, the inevitability of civilization were completely shattered. Yeah. Right. And this kind of speaks to your point about idealism. I think there might be another book to be written about Du Bois and democracy. I mean, I know there's been some books written on that, but to really think about Du Bois, particularly, really throughout the entire span of his life as a democratic thinker, as someone who believed deeply in democracy, small d democracy, not just as a governing principle, but as an ethic, as an ethos. I wish I could have done more with, how William James influenced Du Bois's democratic thinking. But I believe, particularly, in those early years that you mentioned, from 1912 to 1916, his democratic idealism is so profound, right? I mean, he supports Woodrow Wilson, right? And the Democrats in 1912, right? Much to his disillusionment. He learns his lesson very quickly. But, I think, it's important to take him seriously, right? And how he, along with many other intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic, Woodrow Wilson even being one of them, believed that democracy was this inevitable phenomenon. Right? And what made Du Bois unique was that he's conceptualizing democracy, radical at the time in relation to the hopes and aspirations and freedom of African Americans and other peoples of African descent. Right. So I think that's why he's so stubborn and clinging on to his hopes about the war, right? And how the disillusionment of it affects him so deeply. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. The Du Bois papers, I mean, they're remarkable. Thank goodness that they're digitized now, or else.
Yeah. The whole world can use them any day now.
Yeah, right at your fingertips, searchable. So that was a huge benefit. But the main archive that I used is located at Fisk University. So Du Bois donated this, a collection of his papers, which included his World War I manuscript and papers to Fisk in 1961, I believe, right before he went to Ghana. And that is a remarkable archive. Just being able to, as you said, look at the manuscript, to be able to touch it, to be able to see the faded paper, where he was literally cutting and pasting little scraps of paper on top of other little scraps of paper, right? Just how completely neurotic he was, right? I mean, Michelle, you talk about just the thinking about him as a historian, how ambitious he was, the challenges that he tried to overcome with project management. I mean, this was just a incredible project that he envisioned, which ultimately was too big for him, right? And he talks about this in multiple on multiple occasions, right? That this thing stretched on much more than I anticipated. But even having said that, right, he still doesn't find a way to get it done, right? I mean, he finishes Black Reconstruction, which is another huge, massive, 1,000-page manuscript.
Do you think that was his vindication?
I think
do Black Reconstruction and the scale of that, but he didn't have any guilt caught up in that.
Exactly. Right? And I think that's the key. He was able to approach Black Reconstruction, which at one point he envisioned as kind of connected to his World War I book. Thinking about that kind of as history, right? Where he had, a type of distance from it that he didn't have with the First World War, right? As massive as that book was, as challenging as it was for him to write Black Reconstruction, it was still easier than writing the history of the First World War. And
he didn't have a word processor like we do.
Exactly, right. But even going back to the archival question, I think, and Michelle, you brought this up as well, just kind of the tangle of relationships. I mean, the fact that Black veterans are giving him their materials, hoping that he's going to write their history for him. He never returns the majority of these materials. They're still sitting in special collections at Fisk Library as we speak, right? What do we make of Du Bois's ethics as a historian, accumulating all of these materials and ultimately never returning them? So a lot of big questions. But I tried to do my best in telling this big story and doing justice to what I think was Du Bois's real commitment to trying to wrestle with the importance of the war.
Thank you. We're going to open this up now. Before we do so, I'm going to squeeze in a question of my own. I only have about 50, but I'll restrict myself. But Dan Letwin and Nelson Lichtenstein have their hands up in the queue. If you folks would just stand by, we'll get to you in a second. So on this theme of tragedy, what Du Bois learns and applies from his World War I experience to the future. And I'm thinking about the coming of the Second World War. So he remains a pacifist. He is opposed to American entry in the war. He does not think that we have a particular stake in the war. There is a debate that is taking place in the country and amongst African Americans about what does it mean if the Nazis win. And so he's participating a little bit in that conversation, but basically saying the U.S. has no stake. And besides, thinking back to World War I, what became of it? He revisits Closing Ranks and concludes that he wouldn't change a word. And I thought, really, after everything that's happened, he is negative toward those who are pursuing civil rights initiatives in the lead up to and during the Second World War, thinking that it's like contributing to the war hype. Then the Soviet Union gets invaded by the Nazis, that he's willing to kind of rethink what the stakes are. But as I read this, it strikes me that if one were to retain the theme of tragedy, he essentially abstains in a way from the civil rights activities that take place during the Second World War. So there's the March on Washington movement. In virtually every community in the country, there are civil rights protests, and he's not part of it. To a certain extent, he sits it out. Maybe that's partly an issue of age, maybe it's disposition, but I was just struck by, given the World War I experience, he has a chance at kind of a redo in World War II, and he essentially sits on his hands. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Well, I don't think he sits on his hands, because he's still incredibly active. I mean, he's, I think, in his 70s at the time, still energetic, still lucid. He's still writing books, multiple books. In fact, in some ways, he's forced to revisit, all of the trauma of World War I, right? All of the violence, all of the disillusionment as it relates to Black soldiers, but also his support for the war. And this is, I think, where his ego really kicks in, especially when it comes to revisiting closed ranks. You have kind of this younger generation of civil rights leaders, who are, explicitly saying, in various Black newspapers, we're not going to make the same mistake that we made in World War I. We're not going to close ranks anymore, right? We're, W.E.B. So DuBois, the cranky old man that he is at this time, he's like, oh, you young folks don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what it's really like. And I would write close ranks again, damn it. But I think he's fully aware, and his actions demonstrate that the United States didn't have democracy before the Second World War, and it's not going to happen afterwards. His anti-war convictions have become much more hardened. He's deeply cynical, I think, by the time World War II arrives. And then in the aftermath of World War II, with the Cold War, the demonization of any type of association with the radical left and the Soviet Union in particular, that's really kind of the culmination, of his commitments to fighting against war. So I think World War II kind of does and it's not a coincidence that he kind of gives up hope that he's going to finish his book on the First World War right when World War II arrives. So I think that's kind of the ultimate reminder, if you will, of the tragedy of World War I, that it leads to this even more catastrophic war just a couple of decades later.
Great. Thank you. I'll bracket my other 49 questions and we'll call on Dan Letwin. Unmute yourself. Join the conversation.
Hi. Well, this is a really gripping account of DuBois's his long struggle with the meanings of the Great War for people of color. And you really, I think, you convey how the war brought the dilemmas and the challenges of negotiating the double consciousness onto fresh terrain, as David's pointed out as well. Now, before reading your book, the trajectory of DuBois's passage through this period, the war period, had always looked to me kind of like a zigzag. At the outset, he is militant in his opposition to an imperialist war among the European powers. In 1918, amid the pressures and the opportunities following U.S. entry, he tacks, you could say, accommodationist for the moment. It kind of reflects a blend of pragmatic and perhaps guardedly optimistic considerations. And then before long, after all the fierce blowback from within Black America and the brutally evident betrayal of the promise of democratic citizenship, he's back on the militant track and seeking to fuse together the struggles of white supremacy against Jim Crow at home and imperialist domination around the colonized world. But in light of your book, I start to wonder how appropriate this zigzag depiction is. I mean, if according to DuBois's instinct, the defeat of imperial barbarism and the global attainment of interracial democracy are inseparable, then the strategy of closing ranks as a plausible path towards attaining democracy at home could be an essential step towards the broader project that, for instance, the Pan-African Congress represented. And the fact that the closed rank strategy quickly came to naught is not to say that it was necessarily foolhardy or unreasonable looking forward, any more perhaps than Booker T. Washington's accommodationist tack back in 1895 had been looking forward. And that, I mean, surely, my question, surely one of the most stinging rebukes again of his call to close ranks were, I think it was A. Philip Randolph and Owen, the idea that this was his Atlanta Compromise moment. My question, do you see any indications that in light of the failure of Du Bois's own, at least temporarily, accommodationist strategy to bear fruit, did he ever come to view that of the accommodationism of Booker T. Washington that he had so roundly skewered with any greater empathy or forgiveness?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, at least not publicly in any of his writings, he kind of gained a greater sense of empathy for Booker T. Washington. I mean, Du Bois, I think, was very generous after Washington's passing in 1915. Still remained critical, of his views, particularly as related to education and political accommodation. But again, Du Bois's, ego, was such that, he would, never admit failure, and certainly wouldn't admit, that he engaged in the level of compromise and accommodationism on par with Booker T. Washington. I think that one of the aspects of my book I wanted to really emphasize is Du Bois's veneration of the Black military tradition, even going back to the American Revolution. I think his great-great-grandfather served in the American Revolution. His father served in the Civil War. So he's got these personal connections, but also taking war and military service seriously as a historical phenomenon. And, David, I mean, he admired Frederick Douglass, right? And Douglass, said, let the Black man put the brass letters U.S. on his chest. No one can deny that he's a citizen and deserves his freedom. So I think Du Bois is really kind of coming out of that tradition, recognizing the duality, the tension embedded in that, but also seeing it as an opportunity, for African Americans and other peoples of African descent, right? I mean, Michelle, someone like Blaise Diagne, who's also kind of thinking along those lines as well in terms of citizenship for for the educated, elite in Senegal and other places. So, there's a kind of tradition, that Du Bois is steeped in, that, I think he has to reckon with, particularly, in the later years of his life.
Thank you. Nelson Lichtenstein has been patiently waiting. Unmute yourself, sir, and join the conversation. Unmute yourself one more time. There we go.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I want to get, I don't mean to be, I'm trying to get, well, you can't see me, but okay. I wanted to, okay. Well, yeah, this is a great session. This is terrific. I haven't read the book, but I'm going to go out and buy it right away. So I have this question. I'm just thinking, okay, there are moments in American sort of general, attitude toward the First World War, the 20s, early 30s, the period of the Oxford Pledge, we won't fight for king and country, the all quiet in the Western Front, terrific disillusionment, across the spectrum, that earlier period. And then later in the late 30s, you begin to get the Popular Front and a kind of resistance to fascism and the beginning, that change. So my question is, how does that affect Du Bois and this manuscript? And also, you mentioned that Du Bois is sort of coming back to this manuscript. He's working on it. So how should I put it? If you just read this manuscript in, say, 1928 or something, would you see it as an anti-war? I mean, everything was terrible, or would you see it as pro-war? What would it look like if you read it at that? And I was thinking maybe Du Bois, because it was too pro. His original editorial, and it was, in 1928 he would hesitate to put it out there because it looked like a pro-war manuscript, and then later on in the late 30s it would look too anti-war. So what's the relationship there?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the challenges of writing about Du Bois and this topic, and of analyzing the manuscript itself, because it did evolve over the years. He initially kind of envisioned it as this almost vindicationist history, celebratory, almost in kind of a similar vein as Emmett Scott's book, quite frankly. In 1919, 1920, kind of these glorious accounts of Black soldiers and their accomplishments, but also highlighting the incredible racism that they experienced, but still trying to find a way to explain his support for the war, right? To try and find some sense or some semblance, of a positive outcome, in this catastrophe, and ultimately his support for it. That certainly begins to change, by the mid 1920s, as I write about in the book, when he changes the name of the book to The Black Man and the Wounded World, by really kind of acknowledging the central role, right, to David's point, of tragedy in the history of the war. But I think, by certainly by the late 1930s, when at this point he's not really actively writing any more chapters, but he's reconceptualizing what this book could potentially be. And as I argue, he at one point applies for a grant from the American Philosophical Society, and the book that he's arguing for is a much different book than the one that he initially imagines in 1919 or 1920. Right. It's a book that is, I think, much more critical of empire. It's a book that is much more critical of capitalism and the economic roots of the war. And it's one that is, explicitly anti-war. So I do think it's possible to trace, how his views are evolving through how the manuscript itself evolves. But that also presents, a tremendous challenge as well, in terms of thinking about what this book would have ultimately looked like.
Thank you. Christian Anderson has a hand up. Please unmute, pose the question.
Hello, thanks for this wonderful session. I've done a little bit of work on a little known university called the AEFU, American Expeditionary Forces University, that was founded at the end of World War I in Beaune, France, to keep soldiers active and busy while they awaited a chance to get shipped home. And I was very surprised to find in an 1919 issue of the Crisis, a photo of Black soldiers. I would have assumed that they would have kept it for whites only, but apparently there were maybe 24 Black soldiers who are part of this AEFU university. Did you come across this at all? Did Du Bois visit while he was there in France during those 3 months? Did he say anything about it? I haven't had a chance to dig into to find. I'm curious if it came up in your work.
Yeah, no, I do know what you're referring to. To my knowledge, Du Bois didn't visit AEF University. But as I write about in the chapter where I chronicle Du Bois's time in France, he was forming these really close, intimate connections with a number of Black soldiers and Black officers in particular. So I think he probably, I wouldn't be surprised if he knew of those men who did have the opportunity to attend AEF University. And those relationships were really critical for how he's thinking about the conceptualization of his book, and also his post-war disillusionment as well. He's really kind of investing, his hopes, in these men and what they experienced, and really having a sense of responsibility, for their fate, right? He's he supported a segregated officers training camp. He encouraged them to enlist, to represent, the fighting arm of the talented 10th, as I characterize it. And when these men relay to him just how horrific their experience, was, he takes that personally and feels that it's his responsibility through the writing of his book to come to their vindication.
Thank you. We have a number of questions in the Q&A that ask about the sources for the project, and particularly the papers. So you've talked about archival collections in Amherst and at Fisk. You've talked about microfilm, and you've also used the word digital. So if people were to want to get their hands on some of these primary sources, how might they do so?
Well, absolutely taking advantage of the DuBois papers digitized at UMass Amherst, the Credo project. It's really just an incredible resource that's publicly available, made my life much easier. DuBois's own writings, in the crisis, in a number of his books, the war, comes up as a consistent theme throughout so many of his post-war writings, really even throughout the 1950s. I think it's there's a lot there that people can take advantage of. And then, the archival collection at Fisk University. I think it's a reminder that historically Black colleges and universities like Fisk have such tremendous resources that historians need to take advantage of as far as our work. And for any other historians out there who are doing projects, whether it's DuBois or in African American history broadly, to really look at and support those libraries and special collections departments.
Thank you. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee who may get the last word in here, who thanks all of you for this amazing session. But given his disillusionment after World War I, how did DuBois perceive the mobilization around the Italian invasion of Ethiopia?
Yeah, well, I talk about that specifically in the book. And, he is active, in the campaign, to bring awareness to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And, it's really an example of how incredibly prophetic, clairvoyant DuBois is. He writes about, he writes this amazing article in 1915, The African Roots of War, where he's, pinpointing, what the origins of World War I is. And then, when Italy invades Ethiopia, he's similarly writing again at this moment that, look what's happening here in Ethiopia. This is going to be the seeds of the next World War, right? I mean, so he's identifying, the continuation of imperial aggression in Africa on the part of Europe as laying the inevitable foundations for future global conflict, right? Arguing that, look at what Italy's doing in Ethiopia. What's going to stop Germany from acting in a similar way? Whether it's in Africa or in Europe, right? So that's really a critical moment, I think, in DuBois's disillusionment and his hardening views about the legacies of the war, and ultimately how it factors into how he's reconceptualizing his own book, right? How he's seeing the Italian Ethiopian conflict as yet another example, another reason, why his book needs to be really a lesson, a warning call in the risks of modern warfare.
So we could go on for, I don't know, quite some time, and we have many more questions still in the queue, but I unfortunately have to draw this to a close since it's now 5:30. So I want to express my thanks to Chad, to Michelle, to David, and Christian for what I thought was a stimulating and terrific session. And my apologies to those of you in the audience with questions that I wasn't able to get to. With that, let me turn this back over to Christian for the final word.
Just for a final announcement, again, please join us this coming Monday, May 22nd, for a discussion of Sheila Yeager's new book, The Other Great Game, The Opening of Korea and the Birth of Modern East Asia. My thanks again, too, to Chad, Michelle, David, and of course, Eric, for a really inspiring and rich conversation this afternoon. Thanks to all of you out there in the Zoom world for your questions and comments. Stay safe, and we're adjourned. Take care. Thank you.